follow that with the Pledge of Allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. I also just like to start each of my town halls by recognizing our nation's veterans, those who have served this country. So if you're a veteran, could you please stand if you're able or raise your hand if you're pastor's in the room, so I really better not swear. Great to see you. I want to start by recognizing Mayor Janet Williams. Also, Mayor, where are you? Scott County Commissioner here in the room tonight. He may be joining us here in just a moment. State Representative Hunter Cantrell. I'll just start my remarks here in Savage, just saying what an honor it is to represent this part of the district. I had an opportunity to do a farm to freight tour over to the Port of Savage here in the 2019 timeline, and to get a first-hand look at that 12 miles of the Minnesota River and how important it is to economic development in this country. And it's given me a wonderful opportunity with the Army Corps of Engineers to make sure that through my work on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Water Resources Subcommittee, which I serve on, that we have an opportunity to do that. I also had the pleasure of visiting Highmark companies here in the community. And anytime any of us come here, if you come down Highway 13, Mayor, Trunk Highway 13 is always on my mind as I'm doing that work in Washington. And you please report back to the Scott County Commission that I hear them on this. So I want to start my opening remarks by acknowledging a new hire to the team. Is Angelo with us? Angelo? Angelo is Veteran Outreach Fellow. Angelo will be a full-time resource working with veterans in this congressional district. He is also a current member of the Minnesota National Guard. He has served and done tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, and I believe the Horn of Africa, if my memory serves me correct. And so Angelo will be a dedicated resource moving forward from our office on veterans issues. I also just want to say we have, is Kaylee here? Kaylee's not. Okay, we've got Christina here. We've got a couple of caseworkers who work in this district. And I want to tell you about a recent casework win that they had. Just to remind you, if you or your friends or family have any issues with Veterans Affairs, with Social Security, disability, anything like that, please reach out to our office. We had a gentleman named Dennis who reached out to our office from Farmington. And he believed that he had been underpaid by Social Security for 3 months. We looked into it. He thought it was about $600. We looked into it and worked with Social Security. They owed him $19,000.
Wow.
So I'm glad you had that reaction, because I had that reaction too. And that leads, and so thank you to the casework team who continue to serve the The reason I bring it up in my opening remarks is it serves as such an example of the improper payment problems that we have in this country. And I'm really proud to say that I have a bill that has passed the Senate, it's passed the House. It's with President Trump right now to be signed. And it is a bill that I worked with Congressman Mark Meadows on. Mark Meadows and I, at first glance, might be unlikely partners, but I've committed that I'm going to work with anyone who will work with me, and he is ranking member of the Oversight Committee. He's the top Republican on the Oversight Committee. And So I worked with Mark to put together this bill in the House related to improper payments. That could be overpayments or underpayments. Typically, it's Medicare, Medicaid, or earned income tax credit. Those are the three main areas. But it won't surprise a lot of you that there are not a lot of controls in place within the agencies, and there's not a lot of accountability for these improper payments. So this puts more accountability, the same type of legislation that introduced in previous Congresses and not made it across the finish line. But I'm pleased to say that I expect to be the first member of the delegation in the 116th Congress to get a bill signed by the President. So that's the first thing. A couple of other highlights. It's been a little bit less than a month since I was with you last at a town hall, and I've introduced a new bill with Congressman Pete Stauber of the 8th Congressional District and my friend Dean Phillips in the 3rd Congressional District. And that relates to collecting data on insulin. It's data collectability on type 1 diabetics. And the whole point of this is, you know, we talk about these horrible stories from Minnesota and other places about rationing insulin. We talk about how ridiculously high-priced insulin is. What we want is the data collected to show that by not addressing the price of insulin, we're actually leading to overall additional costs of the healthcare system, because these folks end up in the emergency room and they end up readmitted to the hospital because we're not solving the problem at its source. So that's something that Congressman Stauber and I are working on. Since I was last with you, we also signed, the President signed USMCA, so I am very pleased to report that I'm also pleased just to mention my guest at the State of the Union. My guest was a young woman from Burnsville named Kim Cesarek, and she and her husband Dustin and her daughter Reagan, and yes, I asked, is he named after named after President Reagan. And she came in, and she is just a fighter. She has been battling metastatic breast cancer for 7 years now. 7 years. Her daughter was just an infant when she was diagnosed, and she has fought, and she has fought, and she has fought. And if you've ever been to my town hall previously, what I always say is there is so much work left to do to fix, improve healthcare in this country today. But don't forget, 10 years ago, someone like Kim would have met her lifetime limits for healthcare treatment within the first year of battling metastatic breast cancer. Someone like Kim would no longer be eligible for health insurance because she has a pre-existing condition. So as much as we talk about it's either this or that, let's not forget that an awful lot of good has come in the last 10 years, and now we need to work together to make sure that we fix the problem areas. That's why I introduced the State Premium Reduction Act, which would lower the cost of health insurance in the individual market. My understanding is that the bill will come to the House floor here in the first part of this year. It's why I co-sponsored and supported the Elijah Cummings Lower Drug Cost Now Act. And that's because it finally lets Medicare negotiate prescription drug costs and puts part of the is reinvested into the National Institutes of Health and the research that we need at a public level to be able to tackle some of these issues. I also, since we were last together, have sent a letter to the administration asking that we expand eligibility for our Vietnam veterans for cancers and other treatments, other disease states under Agent Orange. This is a really personal issue to me, and I've asked, and the data suggests that there were about 190,000 Vietnam veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange, but their disease state has not yet been listed in the disease states that require treatment by the VA. And so were things like bladder cancer, things like hypertension. We're continuing to learn all of the ways in which Agent Orange put our nation's veterans at risk. Many of you have heard me tell the story before of my uncle, who two uncles served in Vietnam, and one of them was ridden with cancer at 49 years old and died. And of course, that was due to exposure to Agent Orange. So this is a really, really personal issue that I will continue to push for. Pete Stauber and I, we won't let either of our leadership ignore the IDEA Full Funding Act, because I believe fully funding special education in this country is just critical to our communities. We get kind of a reputation with leadership. I keep writing Pelosi, he keeps writing McCarthy, so we keep pushing for that. We've introduced a major transportation and infrastructure package, and just to be clear, I know there was some dust up last year about, Pelosi said, let's do $1 billion. The president said, no, let's do $2 billion, and then everybody got mad and didn't do anything. I continue to be hopeful that we will get an infrastructure bill through my committees, transportation and infrastructure this year. At a minimum, I think we'll reauthorize surface transportation, but I haven't given up on a larger infrastructure bill. We all know that it's not getting any cheaper to fix the roads, and I normally would say fix the damn roads, John, but you're here. It's not getting any cheaper, and interest rates are at historic lows. So, now is the time for us to make a major investment as a country into these infrastructure projects. And then finally, the last thing I will say, and probably the most fun thing I've done since I've been with you, is I helped co-found the bipartisan Congressional Pet Caucus. And we are going to work together across Congress to make sure that we have humane treatment of animals, but at the same time we also expand reach of service animals to the nation's veterans. And as many laws that will encourage adoption of animals across this country. So my Golden Retriever Summit is very happy. My adopted cat, Sophie, she continues to ignore me just like my children. And that's pretty much a sum up of my home life. So again, thank you all for being here today. I apologize, my voice is a little deeper. I actually sound worse than I feel. But I'm getting over a cold, so if I pop a Halls every once in a while, I hope you won't be offended. So, thank you again for being here.
So at this time, we will begin questions. So people can come forward to the microphone.
Don't be shy. I read in your newsletter that you are trying to help make higher education more affordable. How do you do that, and how do you pay for it?
Thank you so much for being here. So we are going to have, we haven't reauthorized the Higher Education Act in more than a decade now. And Pell Grants have not kept up with the rate of inflation. So that's one area where I'm particularly focused in the reauthorization. The other area that I'm incredibly focused on in higher ed reauthorization is ensuring good access to career skills and technical education. This is a priority area for me. And when you think about it, I have advocated for a K through 14 education system across this country, where the first 2 years of either technical college or of community college to reduce the cost of a 4-year college degree are part of how we think about work skill development. The biggest challenge, and it was the same thing when I visited the business in Savage, the biggest challenge that employers had, and it was the biggest challenge that we had at St. Jude all those years when I was there, the biggest challenge was around finding the right skills for the jobs that you have. And so if you think about the economic opportunity, and you ask, how do you pay for it? Well, think about the level of economic growth that we could unleash in this country if 7 out of 10 kids in Minnesota didn't come out of a four-year university with an average of over $31,000 in student loan debt. They wouldn't be putting off their first car, their first house. I've had kids talk to me about putting off a marriage or a baby because both of them have student loan debt equal to basically a house payment. And so I think we've got to think more broadly about education is the best investment to economic growth. It certainly has always been a better investment than tax cuts for corporations or the wealthy. If I on my first answer, I'm 0 for 1. Thanks, team.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming here to my former elementary school. I wanted to thank you so much for for everything you've done to lead our community, and I know that you've also been a really big leader on healthcare in the state of to protect patients in our district and across the state of Minnesota. You even came to visit me when I was on my deathbed at Abbott Northwestern in 2017, so I want to thank you for that. You know, healthcare is a huge issue. We're really worried about how we're going to be able to protect patients with pre-existing conditions should the Affordable Care Act be struck down in court, and ensure that all Minnesotans are able to go see their doctor and access their mental health services and these other essential services that they need to survive and be healthy. So I was just wondering if you'd be able to share a couple of thoughts on some legislation either you're working on or that you're excited to see kind of come up to protect patients, to ensure people are able to get access to healthcare. And I think again, all your work.
You know, Hunter's got more courage for a young man than I've ever seen in my life. The way he battled cancer, he's been very open about that, and what a talented representative. So, Hunter, thank you for your commitment to our community. I do have some thoughts about healthcare. In fact, I have so many thoughts that even though I'm not on any of the healthcare committees, I decided for 2020 I was hiring a health legislative assistant because we already have either written or co-sponsored 65 healthcare bills as your representative. And the reason that I'm doing that is because this is the #1 issue in this congressional district. And I talked about Kim Cesarek in my opening comments, but today, if the administration, as it's arguing down in the Texas court, that the entirety of the ACA should just be thrown out, just throw it out, 35,000 people in the 2nd Congressional District would lose their health insurance tomorrow. And so I think we just have to be more thoughtful. I am not trying to say that the ACA is perfect. In fact, if you've been at my town halls, you know I don't believe it was. I was responsible for implementing it in a Fortune 500 company, responsible for a health plan with 18,000 covered lives. It was self-insured. That's why I believe that the second step is to introduce the State Premium Reduction Act, making sure that just like in other federal insurance programs, we have reinsurance. And this is actually a Republican idea from Minnesota that I have taken to Washington to say, you know what, it's just good policy, so I'm gonna support it. The biggest complaint people say to me, though, is their out-of-pocket cost and the price of prescription drugs. That's why I have advocated for an expansion of the conversation. We can't just talk about the cost of health insurance anymore. We've got to talk about the cost of health care. This is why I've advocated for bills that would create more competition to generic pharmaceutical companies. It's why I've advocated for H.R. 3, Medicare negotiation for prescription drugs. These are the things that I believe we have to move forward with in addition to more competition in the marketplace. I'm 0 for 2.
Just for the record, these first 2 questions are rhetorical, so the major question is at the end. Are you a mandated reporter with respect to child abuse? Would you report your neighbors if they were abusing their children? Since the year 2000, an estimated 10,000 Palestinian children between the ages of 12 and 17 have been detained, prosecuted, and incarcerated by the Israeli military in the occupied West Bank. Often dragged from their homes in the middle of the night by armed soldiers, they suffer physical and emotional violence and frequently face verbal abuse, humiliation, and intimidation. They are interrogated without families or lawyers present in an effort to generate forced confessions. Violence begets violence. This is happening with the support of our tax dollars. Okay, every year the U.S. spends, this district spends $9 million to support this abuse. Will you support Betty McCollum's bill, H.R. 2407, promoting human rights for the Palestinian children under military occupation?
Thank you so much for being here, and I'm glad I'm not the only one who went over today, so thank you for making me. Look, I'm a mother of 4 sons, and so the abuse of children under any circumstances is incredibly important, and we should make sure that that isn't happening anywhere. I have not signed on to Betty McCollum's bill, and the reason I haven't signed on to Betty McCollum's bill is because what the bill says is that the Secretary will ensure that every single dollar in military aid to Israel is not being used to detain any of the children referred to. And the challenge with that, I was in Israel in November, and you know, it's complicated, right? It's the Middle East. That's why I want to do everything we can to stay out of the Middle East with our military members. And the challenge is that Israel has serious security issues. And so the United States, Israel is our most important strategic partner in the Middle East. Israel, the Gaza Strip, now controlled by Hamas, with Iran funding the Islamic State in the Gaza Strip, with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. It's a tough place. It really is. And my heart goes out to the Palestinians and the children. And when I was there, I sat down with, in the West Bank, with the chief peace negotiator from the Palestinian Authority, Dr. Erekat, and talked to him about the possibility of coming back to the table for a peaceful 2-state solution, which is what I support, and I know that not everyone supports that, but I do support a peaceful 2-state solution with defined borders, but I can't condition the military assistance to help Israel protect itself on there never being an instance of impropriety there. And so I appreciate you being here, and I know this is a difficult topic and issue, and I've had to learn a lot about it over the last year.
Hi, I'm Anita from Farmington. I want to thank you, first of all, for mentioning accountability earlier in terms of healthcare and health issues, because it kind of ties into some of my concerns. I was at the Egan Town Hall back in November asking about vaccine safety and returning the liability to the manufacturers. And your comments included following the CDC recommended schedule. I don't know if you're aware, but the CDC is an organization that is privately funded through their foundation. And that foundation is in turn funded by pharmaceutical corporations, medical organizations, retail giants, and other industries, most of whom will profit, either directly or indirectly, every time a vaccine or medication is added to the recommended schedule. This is really unethical, and talking about accountability as you did, a huge conflict of interest. If the CDC fails to comply with what their contributors suggest, they're essentially jeopardizing their own survival. I did bring a list that I can leave of current and previous contributors, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts on why we should trust what the CDC says when their very existence is dependent on funding from companies who stand to profit from their recommendations.
Well, thank you for being here. I know this is a passionate issue for you, and I know that it's a topic that parents care a lot about. Look, the CDC is the organization there to guide physicians on vaccinations and schedules. And so I don't think we should have politicians telling parents. We should have physicians telling parents what that vaccination schedule should be. And Look, I hadn't made any friends in pharma since I've been a member of Congress. I don't know if anybody's noticed on your digital ads yet, but I hadn't made any friends with Big Pharma because I have been very straightforward that their days of 600% increases on Americans need to be numbered, that we need to, that's it, right? This is the number one issue to my constituents, and so I stood up to them. I think we need to reduce the market exclusivity period for patents on biologic drugs, which are often some of the most expensive drugs, compound drugs and specialty drugs. I've stood up to them in the trade agreement, USMCA, when they tried to stick in there a provision that would benefit pharma. So I don't have any love loss with what pharma has done. But right now, the CDC is the best source of information that we have, and our physician community continues to recommend vaccinations on a specific schedule. And we can't allow the diseases that once persisted throughout America to reemerge. We have to make sure that we follow medical recommendations. I appreciate you coming back. My position hasn't changed, but I appreciate you continuing to engage in the conversation. It forces me when I see articles, when I see information, you know, I pause, I look, and I read it. Thank you. Hi, Alexandra.
Okay. The average national prison sentence, is this working?
Yes.
It's working.
Yeah, it is. Is it?
The average national prison sentence for rape is 4 years, for murder 13 years, for drug possession 4 years. State laws are abolishing bail for many crimes under the guise of social justice reform. In New York, Jared Woodbury was arrested and released multiple times for robberies. Criminals are freed from prisons to roam our streets and keep accosting law-abiding citizens. Yet, Roger Stone is convicted to spend the rest of his life in prison for what, exactly? For tweeting congratulations to WikiLeaks? My question is, why is the supposed justice system so much harder on Roger Stone than on criminals plundering our society? And please, don't tell me for lying, because by that rationale, more than half of Congress and high-ranking officials in numerous agencies would be in prison.
Good question.
Well, look, this is an issue that really should be handled in a just completely following the guidelines. So I'm not going to tell you for lying. I'm not going to tell you anything. This is. I'm going to tell you that your member of Congress needs to stay focused on reducing the cost of health care, on making sure that we are funding our infrastructure, on supporting family farmers in the 2nd Congressional District, on funding special education, and on career and technical education. And look, you know, I am going to stay focused, and there are plenty of shiny red lights and dots that I could look up and follow every single day, but I have dedicated my first year in Congress to working across the aisle to try to find solutions to common sense problems and focusing on the things that this district cares the most about, not the things that I can't impact or do anything about.
So the two-tier justice
You're done.
system is
You
okay.
have one question.
One question.
You're done.
One question.
So,
You know,
Next
you never
person.
answer my questions.
She did.
No, she didn't.
She did.
I'll be nice.
So, hi, thank you for being here. My name is Tim Reckmeyer. I represent the Scott County chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. First, thank you very much for co-sponsoring the bipartisan Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. My question simply is, how are your efforts going as
That
far
mic
as
is not
reaching
working.
across?
Or it needs to be up higher.
Either that or I need to be lower.
There you
Mouth and mic is the answer.
There we go.
There, is that better?
Give you time to start all over again.
Thank you, sir. All right, so my name is Tim Reckmeyer. I represent the Scott County chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. Thank you very much for co-sponsoring the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And I would simply like to know if you've had conversations with Republicans on the other side of the aisle to bring them on board and co-sponsor that act with you, how that's gone. And if you haven't, I would like to know if you would be willing to commit to doing so over the next 30, 60, 90 days.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do think, for those of you who aren't as familiar with this, look, we are going to have to think about a number of ways in which to address climate change across the world. And I will tell you that in the course of the next several months, the Select Committee on Climate Crisis will be releasing its full report. Congresswoman Kathy Castor has been in charge of that effort. And I'm assured that part of that report will talk about carbon pricing. The reason I like the carbon fee and dividend approach, the Innovation Act, that your question is about, is because what it does is it puts a price to the polluters on the actual, to them, but if and when energy costs go up, it doesn't go to the U.S. Treasury, it goes back to U.S. taxpayers in the form of a dividend. So it's not a tax that goes to the Treasury, it is a dividend return to American households. So it is an elegant way, I believe, to be able to put a price on carbon, to start to tackle the climate challenge that we have. It's not the only solution. I think we have got to look at how we engage family farmers in this country. We have got to make them part of the solution. We've got to make sure that we don't blame them. We've got to incentivize cover crops for carbon sequestration across this country. And in my role on the Ag Committee, this is one of the things that I'm looking for every single day, is how can I work in the conservation arena to help reduce carbon emissions and battle back climate change. But a number of ideas are going to come out of this report. Thank you.
Hi Angie, how you doing?
Hey, Steve from Zobroda.
Say Angie, I don't know if you got my packet or not in the mail. If you got a chance to see it, probably didn't. I don't know if you did or not.
It got scanned to me this morning, so I have seen it.
Okay. Anyway, I did not have a part in there that I have here with me. I'm going to send it to you next week. And I had a brutal time trying to find my way through the CDC website, you know, to find the information that I wanted to get to you about late-term abortions survivors, you know, little kids that survived the abortions. And I did find it, and there were quite a few instances, not a lot, but this is some, you know, it's the ones that are reported to the CDC, you understand. And so it is there, and I have a hard time understanding why we don't have legislation to protect these little ones who are alive, in a way, because they are a human being, and they're a little baby, and some suffered for days, you know, struggling to live. That's torture. And when you talk about child abuse, that's ultimately. And Abortion Survivors Protection Act would assure them a right to life. And as they could be into adoption, which you've been part of, and it makes your life whole and complete, and it helps the family out. That's the whole idea of our life, you know. So that's why I'm pleading with you for that.
Well, Steve, I thank you for sending the materials post my last town hall. I really appreciate it. And in particular, I enjoyed the photos of you with the family. I did look at the material, and as you know, as I said when we were together before, it is extremely rare to see the procedure performed after 21 weeks. And to be honest with you, you know, the information you sent bore that out, that it is only in the terrible, heart-wrenching instance when a woman's life is in jeopardy. And, you know, to me, Steve, this is a healthcare decision. A patient's health should drive important medical decisions, not a politician. And so I would say to you, I know this is an incredibly personal issue, but I simply believe that a woman in consultation with her family, her faith, and her doctor should make this very important decision on her own.
She did. That's what she ended up with a live baby. That's a different story. Thank you.
Thank you for your passion for the topic. You know I respect you.
Hi Angie, my name is Jean Foreman. I'm a constituent from Burnsville. I'm a registered nurse and a proud member of Minnesota Nurse Association here in Minnesota. I have a kind of a two-pronged question about healthcare and union activism and rights regarding corporate healthcare. As you know, not in our district, but in our metro area, we're facing some cuts at a couple hospitals. Bethesda and St. Joe's, my union siblings, are being negatively impacted in their passion for delivering quality health care to extremely vulnerable patients. In my own hospital, I work at Abbott Northwestern Hospital, we are facing layoffs in different departments where nurses are serving patients and are losing that ability because of finances. And so my question is, how can we protect our union contracts that have specific things laid out? And I know you're a very sponsor of the PRO Act, which is a great first step. The NLRB is letting us down in a lot of areas by allowing less union activism and strength in our work. So I want to protect patients and protect nurses' contracts who then advocate for patients. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for being here. And thank you for what you do as a nurse. For what we do for our nation's patients. I have been a strong supporter of the PRO Act, which actually just passed the House a few weeks ago. It is somewhere in the stack of 400 bills sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk at the moment. So hopefully at some point in this country, we will be able to come back and protect workers' organizing rights. You know, the thing that I think about the most when it comes to our nation's nurses is workplace safety. You know, I know that's one of the biggest issues that nurses bring up to me is how can we make sure as you're handling, you know, we're seeing more mentally ill patients in your units. We're seeing more substance use in your units. You know, how can we make sure that you have the manpower on staff as hospitals see their profit margins tighten? How do we make sure that we've got proper workforce and staffing? And so, look, I'm always going to stand with you in your workplace, and I appreciate everything that you're doing to advocate for the nation's nurses.
Our healthcare organizations are very profitable, so while I appreciate their need to have money to run their business, they are making lots of money, as evidenced by multi-million-dollar CEOs, again, at the expense of
Why wasn't I allowed to talk?
Yeah, that's different.
Thank you.
Good evening, Representative Angie Craig. My name is Justin Matea, Prior Lake. For those who don't know me, I was born and raised in communist country, so my perspective sometimes is a little different than most of you guys. Thank you. As I was watching the State of the Union address, I could not ignore Speaker Pelosi dressed in white, making ridiculous facial expression, and then turning up the speech document. I realized that you cannot control her behavior. However, by dressing in white, you sent a message that you support her. In my opinion, she's got no class by doing what she did. My question is simple. Do you think such behavior by the speaker on national TV is appropriate? And are you going to continue to support her? And if so, why? Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you for being here. I appreciate your at most of my town halls, and that's what democracy is about, is being able to show up and ask these questions. Let me start with your very direct question. I did not approve of her ripping up the speech. I didn't approve of it. You know, I was in Cub Foods a few weeks ago, and I was volunteering for the Open Door, a food pantry in our congressional district, one of my favorite 501c3s. And as I was talking to constituents, trying to sell them a bag of canned goods so that they would hand it over to the Open Door on their way out the door, there was one gentleman who came sort of back and forth to me several times. And, you know, I knew he wanted to say something, And he wasn't quite either sure how to say it yet, or he was, getting his thoughts together to say it to me. And this happened the Saturday before the State of the Union. And when he came to me and finally said, Representative, I have my thoughts together, he said to me, I just want the two parties to try to work together. That's it. And so I didn't think the lack of a handshake was appropriate. I didn't think ripping up the State of the Union was appropriate. And then I will just say, I wore white because it's the 100th year anniversary of the suffrage movement. I want to celebrate women having the right to vote. It was South St. Paul women, and it was a municipal water bonding election that had the very first vote in the entire history of the United States, South St. Paul. So, I want to just say that's why I wore white. And I will continue, as I hope I have demonstrated, to work with the administration when I believe it's a good idea, to stand up to them when I don't, and I commit to you to do the same as I have to the Democratic Party as well. And thank you so much for being here again.
Angie, first of all, I just want to say thanks.
Get by the mic.
Pull it up to you, or even hold it.
Okay. You have so sincerely fulfilled the commitments you made in your campaign, and tonight is just one more example of that. Your accessibility has been absolutely outstanding, so thank you so much for that. The question really comes out of something I'm very fearful of, and that is every day I feel like we're losing a shred or a piece of our democracy. And my personal opinion is that a lot of this comes from the dark money that's allowed to come into campaigns. So I'm wondering, is there anything in election reform that can be done in the current Congress? And the second half of my question is, what can we do as citizens to improve on election reform?
Well, thank you again so much for being here. The bill, when I'm asked, what is the most important bill that the House has passed in this 116th Congress, my answer is always the same, and that is H.R. 1. Because H.R. 1 would provide transparency to the dark money that's coming into our nation's campaigns. On the super PAC side, let's be clear. Corporations under Citizens United were ruled people. Well, okay, if they're people, I of course support repealing Citizens United, but if corporations are people, then why shouldn't we require the transparency of disclosure of which corporations are funding super PACs? Because, as you say, none of the reforms that require standing up to special interest can be accomplished when super PACs and corporations are able to spend unlimited money on campaigns without transparency. With transparency, it's unrealistic to think that Citizens United would be ratified as a constitutional amendment. That's not going to happen at this moment in time. But we've got to keep working to make sure that you all know who is funding my campaigns. Everyone who donates to me more than $199 is listed on my website right now, because I committed that I would have that level of transparency and disclosure. The super PACs who perhaps someday will run ads for me should be disclosed to you. Those that run ads against me should be disclosed to you. So, Scott, I think H.R. 1 is the most important piece of legislation to taking on the cost of prescription drugs and everything else. And that's what I would love to see Mitch McConnell put on the Senate floor, regardless of the vote. I think the American people deserve a vote on that bill. Thank you.
was gonna ask about HR one, but, first off, it was the 2-year anniversary of Parkland. And for all of the survivors of gun violence, I wanna thank you for supporting HR 8. I'm hoping at some point it will actually make it to the floor of the Senate and we can start looking at some common sense, gun violence prevention bills. But in line with HR 1, we've got the census coming up this year. And the more I hear about it, the more I worry about people feeling comfortable filling out the forms because so much is at stake. Whether we even still have 8 congressional districts. And I know that our district is really vast. And so for people to be represented, they need to be able to reach their representative. And the larger the area, the harder it is. Plus, there's a lot of funding that comes with those dollars with the census. So I'm wondering what, if any, outreach your office and you are planning on doing to make sure that everybody feels comfortable filling out the census, and to make sure people really understand how important it is.
Well, thank you so much. You know, my biggest focus on the census was making sure that we had the appropriations in the budget to fund an accurate census across this country. And so it is true, Minnesota is projected to potentially lose a congressional seat in 2022, which would, of course, require massive redistricting if we went from 8 to 7 congressional seats. So that was my main focus, is making sure that the funding was in there. Thank you for mentioning the Parkland 2-year anniversary. It's critically important. It's probably the #1 topic in the supermarket that suburban moms come up and talk to me about, and suburban dads, to talk about gun violence in our country. And a lot of this is being driven by the active shooter drills that their children are going through here this time of year. And look, I've supported everything from rebuilding America's schools in order to make sure our schools are safer, but I've also supported what I believe is common sense gun safety reform. Many of you know that I belong to the West End Trap Club. 2 of my sons shot in high school. I have been turkey hunting with the governor. I myself own a 20 gauge over-under, and I go trap shooting with the boys sometimes. So my family is very comfortable, and I do not see a conflict with my support for the Second Amendment and my support for HR 8, which is universal background checks at gun shows and online purchases. So I think there is a level of just common sense that we can put in place here, and that won't prevent every act of violence in this country. Certainly, I'm not naive, but will improve gun violence. And look, the biggest gun violence in this country is suicide attempt and completion. And as we are challenged with mental health issues, 20 veterans a day are dying in this country, I just think we have to be open to reforms. And of course, I was proud to see the CDC finally get some money to study gun violence in the last appropriations bill.
That's a good segue into my topic. I'm Paula Achenbach, and I'm a child and family therapist in Bloomsville. And for me, mental health is, of course, in my daily work. A couple things happened this week that made me think about, what the heck are we doing again? This time of year, people's insurances come back, and families are faced with high deductibles. Who comes into my office are people who can afford it, people who have a high income, and those on medical assistance. Not those in the middle. They don't come in. I had a kid this week who told me he was very depressed, very sad, feeling suicidal, talked to his parents 3 weeks ago. And I think their big holdup is they don't want to pay for the insurance, the money to go in to see the doctor. I'm just very concerned about where this is going. We talk about saving costs. A girl came in today, told me that one of her best friends was put in a bed in Fergus Falls because we don't have enough beds in here. This woman today was talking about closing 2 hospitals. Well, one of those hospitals is pretty much helping mental health.
That's right.
What the heck? I mean, these are frontline issues that not only do I have to deal with every day, but families have to deal with every day. It's just not okay that the rich and the poor get mental health services. It's just not. We've got to do something about this and this co-occurring issues like people who have health issues and they're not getting treated because they can't afford it.
Paula, thank you so much for being here, and I couldn't agree with you more, that it's the middle class that's been hollowed out over the course of the last several decades in this nation, and that is why I've been so focused on healthcare. In fact, I've got my Healthcare LA from DC Merrill over in the corner here tonight, the one that I referred to earlier today, and that's why I've been working with farmers particularly, and folks in rural areas, because it gets even worse in rural communities in the southern part of this congressional district. The lack of access to beds, the lack of access to health insurance. Even if you have health insurance anymore, the deductibles are so high, they are prohibitive. And when I talk to my constituents, it's, you know, the co-pays, it's the premiums, it's the deductibles, and it's the price of prescription drugs. And, we put forward the Elijah Cummings bill. Certainly that was a bit of a wish list, but I would come back to the table and work on more narrow reforms too if I thought we could get them signed by the president. You know, the president has said, and I'm going to take him at his word, that he wants to take on the price of prescription drugs. And so, let's come back to the table and work on this together. This also plays itself out in our nation's schools with the lack of school counselors and referrals to psychiatrists. There are only a few, just a handful of pediatric psychiatrists in the entire Twin Cities.
Yeah, like 25.
And this is really personal to me. I have a special needs son myself, and he's got learning challenges, and we have to continue to push this healthcare system and reform it. But I personally don't believe we can just say, because it was somebody else's plan, let's throw the whole healthcare system out and start over. And so that's going to require Democrats and Republicans to come together, and it's going to require us to figure out how can we stabilize the healthcare system, and how can we take on the special interests that are running Washington. Pharma's the worst, by the way.
Hi, Angie.
Can you introduce yourself, because I know you're a member of the school board?
Yes, I'm Mary France. I'm a member of the Fire Lake Savage School Board.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you for yours. It was a wonderful segue about mental health support in the schools. And in the beginning, you mentioned support for funding IDEAS, the IDEAS Act in the 1970s. And that's one of my questions. The IDEAS Act passed in the 1970s. We've had over 22 Congresses under different leadership since then. The IDEAS Act promises 70% subsidy for the handling of handicapped students and disabled students, which includes mental health these days. And why hasn't it passed? I know you support it. Why hasn't it passed under both party leaderships? And what are you going to do to change that track record?
Well, thank you so much. And that's a great question, because, and it's a fair question. What makes you think that this is going to be any different? Minnesota, so I'll check my facts, Mary, here after tonight, but I believe the federal government overall said 40% when we mandated IDEA to the schools, that we would fund up to 40% of the cost. In Minnesota, that subsidy right now, depending on the school district, is between 8 and 15% of the 40%. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because Minnesota ranks 47th in the nation in the dollars that we send to Washington versus what we get back here in Minnesota. And so the real question is, if we look at the appropriations process, we can pass a bill that says you should do it, but unless it gets appropriated, the money doesn't flow down to the schools. And it's such a slippery slope. I've talked to mayors like Janet Williams here in Savage, who, you know, the impact of not fully funding special ed is that the district has to go into the operating budget and steal from regular ed, which means bigger class sizes for regular ed teachers. And when that's not enough, we go back to our communities for an operating levy increase, and we ask taxpayers to make up the difference. So why hasn't it passed? I keep asking the same question. If we get a hearing on the IDEA Full Funding Act, it will be the first hearing out of Labor and Education that this bill has ever received. And it's not unreasonable, the bill itself, because what it says, and then you're going to tell me, no, that's too long, is that over 10 years, we will move to 40%. And in this bill, if we look at the appropriations process just in this last year, the amount of appropriations for IDEA was $400 million more than the fiscal year before it. So we got the largest increase in IDEA funding in the appropriations process this last year. But it needs to keep ticking up. Look, the budget, appropriations, it is a reflection of the nation's priorities. And if our priority isn't to educate and provide good public schools for our children, what better priority could we have that creates more economic growth in the future than making sure our kids are equipped to be successful? 5 seconds over.
Okay, at this point, I just want to remind everyone in the room that our town hall was supposed to go till 8 o'clock tonight, so we want to be conscious of everyone's time. So at this point, we would like to take 2 more questions.
And I think we've got some cards, if you were going to ask a question, that you can fill out, and that will definitely get to me. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Representative Craig. I'm Michael Stos, Savage resident. And to echo others, thank you again for your accessibility and for being here tonight. Climate change and healthcare are huge issues for me, but frankly, I'm also terrified about what's going on in the Department of Justice right now. And some may think it's a bit hyperbolic, but I'm seriously concerned for the future of our democracy and with the corrupt Attorney General. And so I'm wondering what the House of Representatives can do, will do, might do in addressing the criminal, and I do think he's a criminal, Attorney General Bill Barr.
Well, you don't have to hear me say that there's a problem in the Justice Department. You only have to listen to the 1,100 former leaders and members of the Justice Department who recently wrote a letter to say that there's a problem at the Justice Department. Look, you know, there's a reason why we have career professionals who are there to follow out the guidelines and the laws. The answer to your question is I'm not on any of the oversight committees, and I've been back in Minnesota since last Friday, and a lot of this information is very, very new. But look, we have a constitution for a reason. There are checks and balances in it for a reason, and we should continue to have a Justice Department that seeks justice based on the guidelines. And so I'll let others within the House decide how and whether to proceed. And I will say to you exactly what I said to Alexandra. In the meantime, the best thing that I can do is to stay focused on healthcare and infrastructure and family farming and the things that you brought me here to focus on. But I assure you that I agree with your position that it is very disturbing.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. Thank you, Angie Craig, for being our representative and for your accessibility to this town hall. One of the important issues for me is the border crisis, right? 24 people dying in ICE detention, some of them children, right? You said you have children of your own. So I'm wondering what the House of Representatives and what you're doing to
to address this issue and to prevent more deaths? And also, if you could say anything about the border crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. What I will say is I had the opportunity to tour the border in August of, I think it was August of last year, and see firsthand the conditions at the border. And, no one should be dying in U.S. custody. That's first and foremost. Secondly, it's really fascinating as you sit and you listen to even Customs and Border Patrol, what they say they need versus what the administration is asking for in some of its appropriations bills. We know that asylum seekers are seeking legal entry into the United States. That is a legal way to seek entry into this country. And we have a responsibility to be a humane country that considers each of these cases independently while at the same time protecting our borders. What CBP said to me is they need more cameras, they need more drones, they need more technology to be able to keep our borders safe. But we also need to bring our humanity back to this immigration discussion, because children should never be separated from their families. I serve on the Ag Committee. I've got a Family Farmer Advisory Council that gives me a lot of advice and counsel. And this group of people, particularly with H-2A, immigrants have helped build this country. 40% of the Fortune 500 in our community are either immigrants or children of immigrants. And workforce labor in the ag community, it's the #1 issue they ask me about. These are people who, could be fully vetted and could come here and contribute to the economic growth of this country, but they need to go through a process. We know that, and we need to make sure that they are treated with the humanity that they deserve. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and thank you to Angie, and drive safe.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.